Your 2019 book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is currently a #1 nonfiction bestseller.
Number 4, racists believe that racial inequality is caused by inferior black culture. Here, Kendi talks about 2 types of people here, assimilationist and segregationist. The author points to notable personalities talking about damaging ghetto culture that needed to be tackled, and some black people would need to be taught a better work ethic, how to respect their own families and value of an education, instead of talking about providing opportunities and essential goods without discrimination and systemic prejudice. The author points that those who talk about assimilationist views fail to realize that everybody is a product of their environment.
Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with his history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
Unlike assimilationists, a segregationist idea advocates that people of color are incapable of developing, thus instead supporting any cultural development programs. Segregationists advocate for policies that separate people of color.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
An anti-racist is neither assimilationist or a segregationist. Number 5. It is racist to believe that meaningful biological differences between the races exist. These include the notion that black people were naturally better at physical activity and that African Americans dominated in jazz and hip hop because they had a genetic ability to make quick and ad hoc decisions, or that black men had large penises and black women had large buttocks.
Incredible career has been surrounded by racism and sexism, and that's why
Australia tried to explain William's win by saying it's the African American race. They just have this huge gluteal strength. With Serena, that's her physique and genetics.
she's had to deal with a ton of bizarre scrutiny of her body that taps into the politics of racism and sexism. For some commentators, that has meant stripping her of her femininity. The president of the Russian Tennis Federation infamously called the Williams sisters brothers.
Братьев Уильямс.
Unfortunately, these perceptions are a hallmark of biological racism and problematic thinking that sadly many of us have entertained at some point in our lives. A biological racist believes that there are meaningful biological differences between the races, and secondly, they believe these characteristics are either superior or inferior. By contrast, a biological anti-racist believes and understands that in all meaningful ways we are biologically the same, and author points out so many scientific facts, including the one which says every human being has 99.8% identical genetic makeup. Number 6. Black people are just as capable of anti-black racism as their white counterparts. Kendi points out to a meeting with an African-American newspaper editor and was taken aback when the editor told him that he was fed up with being treated by the police as if he was one of those N-words, and implied distinction of superiority between himself and the lower income black people. Aside from shock and hurt of the word, the author especially was outraged because the editor was black himself. Unfortunately, Kendi notes that he had to encounter too many of such encounters. For instance, in a 2017 survey by the Pew Research Center found that a third of African Americans expressed racist ideas that lower income black Americans are largely responsible for their own impoverished circumstances and that racism was not the cause of their inequality. However, according to the author, to be an anti-racist is to understand that this belief is disempowering to people of color because it tells them that black people are basically powerless to do anything to combat racism. And finally, number 7. Racism has spread through society like a cancer, but we can beat it. In early 2018, Kendi was diagnosed with cancer at stage 4, which had already spread to other parts of his body. He learned that stage 4 patients have only 12% chance of survival over the following 5 years. And he began to see similarities between cancer and racism. Nonetheless, one major difference between racism and cancer is that people with cancer tend to accept they are ill and try to stop the illness from spreading. When it comes to racism, however, many are still in denial that there is anything wrong. Indeed, too many Americans refuse to look at their country's racial inequality or at the inequality that exists in their own neighborhoods and workplaces. Even when they do, they all too often simply refuse to do anything about it. Fortunately, the author has reason for hope because he is among the 12% of people that do beat stage 4 colon cancer and is now in remission. Similarly, an anti-racist must keep fighting and dreaming of a world where justice and opportunity and resources are available to everyone irrespective of their race.